Welcome to this week's edition of Dugout Dish Podcast. I'm Andy Kirikides, joined by my wonderful co-host, Keith Glasser. Keith, how we doing?
Great, how are you?
Good. Got another awesome guest on tonight. I'm going to touch on a topic that we haven't touched on the podcast, and I think is incredibly important, relevant, and I think this is going to be a really good conversation that's going to be valuable for all of our listeners moving forward. So why don't you introduce our guest for the evening?
Sure. Tonight we're joined by, as we've, this year, most of our listeners have figured out, we're branching off into a couple other topics in the recruiting process that are relevant to what we have going on. We've talked a lot more about strength and conditioning, but I was excited when this guy reached out to us and wanted to come on and talk with us, and I was fired up because we'd been talking about bringing on other stuff. And tonight we're joined by Michael Huber, who is a certified mental performance consultant, to talk about the mental skills and the aspect of the mental side of the game from a baseball standpoint. And I think he's going to be awesome. So Mike, thanks for joining us.
Keith, Andy, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
No, we're super excited to have you. Andy and I have been kicking around this idea of having more than just college baseball coaches on here. So it kind of came at the perfect time, and I was like, yeah, let's do it. But if you could, before we get going, just give our listeners a quick rundown of your background and how you got to be doing mental performance consulting.
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of a long and winding road. So sports psychology is my second career. I went back to school in 2017 to get a master's degree in sports psychology, started my practice in 2020, and have been doing it for about 5 years now. But my entry into the field was really inspired by my experiences as a player and as a coach, as a parent. So, going back, I played high school baseball, started a couple of years, was a pretty good player, but, I wasn't great. But the thing that really held me back was the mental side. And I went through some really tough times, like stretches and slumps in high school that I look back on now that I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a kid today with all of the exposure in social media. Like I was in my head in the early 90s, I couldn't get out of my own head. And so in my 20s, I started playing baseball again in adult leagues, and 25 years old till I was about 40. And I started playing the game again for fun. But for a while, it wasn't even fun. Like I was right back in that place of self-judgment and beating myself up and staring at the ceiling at night, as a 30-year-old guy who's got to go to work and he's got a couple of kids in a crib, and I'm thinking about baseball. And so it started to get me thinking about how hard the game is for people where the game matters. Then I started coaching baseball, and I started to see some of the things that parents would say and do and what other coaches would say and do, and some of the things that kids were forced to deal with. And put all that stuff together, I was like, there's got to be a role for somebody out there who has the best interest at the kid at heart, who wants to give them some of those coping skills that I didn't have as a player, right? I want to be that guy that I didn't have when I was growing up as a baseball player. And so that's where I'm at today. I mean, I work with all different sports, but I'd say 50% of my clients are baseball players.
It's a tough game, right? It always gets mentioned as it's a game of failure, right? Like if you're a hitter and you're really good, you're failing, 3.5 out of 10 times. And there's all kinds of ups and downs from pitch to pitch, from play to play. And I think that the mental side of things not only applies to the game itself, right? And hopefully we'll be able to unpack some stuff that guys can put into practice, but there's also the stress of the recruiting process and the anxiety that comes with that. And I know before we got started here, we were talking a little bit about the social media piece and how it's such a new thing, and it may not seem new to this generation, but the three of us aren't that far removed from playing college baseball, playing high school baseball, and it's a completely different world that we're in right now. And I think that some of the pressures that these kids are introduced to, I don't want to say it's just social media, but I think that that's an added layer that makes it more complex and can make it a little bit more difficult. And add stress to a situation that's already stressful. I mean, we talked about that if you're going to play college baseball, you're kind of immediately an outlier, being one of the 10%, give or take, if you include NAI and JUCO. To get there is stressful. And I think that some of the mental side of it can really help kids as they go. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on some of that stuff before we kind of get into some of the stuff that you do with your players and some of the things that guys can put into play.
Yeah, I think social media is absolutely a contributor to some of the stress that young players feel, right? Like any situation where a player is going to be evaluated, right? It could be in a showcase where there's nobody around, right? Or it could be a tryout for your high school team. Anywhere you're being evaluated, it's going to be stressful, right? Because you're going to want to produce a result that makes you look like, hey, I belong here. Then you throw in someone with their phone taking a video of it and sticking it on social media. You're that guy who gives up the game-winning home run, or you strike out with the bases loaded in a big game, and it's right there in your face, right? So like that has to be in a player's head. Or college coaches are watching, and you go up there and you poop the bed and you can't get your command, in a tournament game and all this different stuff, and it's all over the place, and it's like it almost feels like it's so overwhelming that you can't get a hold of it because there's so much you can't control. And that's one of the core tenets of any of the work that I would do with a player is let's focus on what we can control, as hard as it might seem it might be to do.
What you talk about, you've got about 50% of your clients in baseball. Like, what are some of the core tenets that you discuss with them in terms of dealing with either performance anxiety, or a kid might be in a situation that he's never been in, like we talked about earlier, that you get freshmen who get onto college campuses and all of a sudden you're not the best guy. And how do we deal with that? How do we stick to process? How do we show up every day? Like, what are some of those conversations look like, and what are some of the things that you focus on with your clients?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'm a huge process guy. And I think that that's probably the most critical element of any player's mental skills regimen. However, I think thinking about the big picture can be really valuable. So what I mean by that is, why am I playing the game? Right? Like I work with kids who are now in college or they're in professional baseball. And like that's an opportunity that like we talked about before, like a very small portion of the population that plays baseball gets to do, right? So a little bit of gratitude, right? A little bit of perspective, like, hey, this is what you wanted and it wasn't going to be easy. So why not just appreciate it and focus on getting better and improving, right? I want to be the best player I could be when I'm draft eligible. I want to be the best player I can be in my 5th year so I can leave and, leave my uniform and feel like I gave everything I could, versus I have to play right now, and it's all focused on the immediate gratification, which is something that's really hard to wrestle with, right? Especially in the social media world. But then it's really about coming back to, what do I control? How do I do the little things every day to take my focus off the stuff I can't do anything about? And that's really hard for kids because they're not really taught that. They hear it sometimes, but they don't really learn how to use those skills in the heat of battle. That's the biggest challenge, is how do you apply it in the heat of battle so that you can get the most out of it? We can know to take a deep breath, but we don't know, if we don't know what it does or we don't do it consistently, it's not going to be as effective as this is part of the routine where it's just push the button, start over, push the button, start over. I always have it at my disposal.
Yeah, the in-game ability to control those emotions is, and I think what you're driving at is it takes practice, like anything else, in being able to recognize a moment where your heart rate goes up, or you've got some negative thoughts starting to flood into your head, and like, do you have the tools? Do you have the awareness to be able to step away from it? But you talk about the things that you can control, and I think sometimes this gets hit as like a cliche because it does get said, but obviously with what we do, helping players go through this process, for a lot of guys, when we first engage with them and their families, this is a conversation that we have with them, is that we need to put in place a process where you're controlling the things that are going to help you get to the outcome that you're looking for. Right. And I don't think it's much different than the game time stuff, but like for a lot of young kids, it's just getting into a routine of, I need to get into the weight room. I need to make sure that I'm doing my mobility work. I need to make sure that I'm getting enough sleep. And
Mhm.
that seems like simple stuff, but it's a part of a bigger picture that ultimately allows those kids to get to where they're going. And I don't think the mental side of it is any different. It just might be a little bit more unfamiliar to kids.
I don't think it's different at all, right? And I think what you're describing, right, whether you're helping them on the recruiting side or you're helping them on the mental side, or even if you're helping them on the field, right? As coaches, we all have the same challenge as getting the buy-in, right? Like we can say these are the things that you should be doing because we know and we're giving you the information that you want. But if they can't connect it to like, hey, this thing that I'm doing right now is going to help me get there, and they don't believe it, they're probably not going to do it because there's all these other things that they need to do. And honestly, the mental part of it for me, what I see is it falls to the bottom of the equation. So like my job is a lot harder unless I get a kid who's just so motivated and just so mature, or they're just at the bottom of the barrel in terms of where their head's at. And they're so desperate that they'll listen to anything that you tell them. But 90% in between of that is like, hey, I know I need this help. I know this is going to help me. And I know baseball is a mental game. But then when you ask them to do some of these things that are uncomfortable or different or new, they don't really get it. So it's hard. And I'm not on the field. And I've coached mental skills on the field, and it's a lot easier because you could start to connect the dots to, I see you doing this. What about trying this versus I see you on a Zoom and now I'm going to go trust that you're going to go do this thing. And then you come back and tell me you didn't do it. Why? Well, I forgot. Right. So that's part of the challenge that I face as well. And so I have to really be strategic in terms of getting them to have tactics that they can use, right? So that it's always with them so they don't forget.
Oh, go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think baseball is one of the, obviously we all played baseball. Like I think it's a little bit harder mentally, not only because of the failure of the game, but I think like I used to always talk about with my guys, like you can't get too high and you can't get too low because over the court, like a 9-inning game, it could take an hour and 15 minutes. It could take 3.5 hours. You could be playing extra, pretty much every other sport, there's a designated time frame in which that game is being played. And I always felt like it was a tad, like I played football, I wrestled, like I felt like it was a lot easier to be like, you could get super high and keep it for a little bit longer when it's like, okay, I have to blow this out on football for however many plays it is I'm on. But, in baseball, it's like your inning could be 3 pitches, it could be 60 and you gave up 9 runs. And like, I just always felt like the ebbs and flow of baseball are, you can't get to, like, it's too hard to sustain mentally being way too up or way too down to then try to pull yourself back to neutral or pull yourself out of the basement to get back to neutral. And it can take, and as weird as that does sound, like the game speeds up on you so fast that like, yeah, there is no time and it can, like, it seems slow to people, but in the context of the play, you're talking about plays being made in less than 4 seconds. Like it can go fast on you. And I think it's super interesting. Like I love the process and like we would talk about it all the time, but I wanted to throw that out there. Like I just think in the context of baseball, I'm not saying other sports aren't hard. I just always thought that like not having a straight up like time constraint on what you're doing, like, yeah, well, if dude goes out and shoves and we play a 2-1 game, like we can be out of here in an hour. But like, it's a Sunday or a midweek game, like we could be out here for 3.5, 4 hours and it's a 15-14 ball game. Like you have to be locked in, quote unquote, for that entire time frame. And I just always thought that was a tough thing for younger kids, especially to kind of grasp that concept of like, yeah, man, you can get super amped up in the second inning because we're up by 5, but we still have 7.5 innings to play. Like a lot can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And like, I think the other thing is not only like the duration of the game, but just there's so much, it seems like a lot of time to think in between pitches or in between innings where your mind can go anywhere. The metaphor I use is it's a roller coaster, right? Keith, you were just describing that, right? Like you get super high and then you bottom out and you're riding that roller coaster over the course of the game, right? Which is like, we'll get into this, I'm sure, but like having a plan and a routine to reset yourself, right? And the most extreme example I could give to any player, whether you're a pitcher or a hitter, is every single pitch that happens, you reset regardless of the result. Because like every new pitch is a new opportunity. You need to be completely focused on that. Most kids, most players use a reset when they're drowning, right? Like, oh, things are really bad, I'm going to reset now, versus, hey, the result of the last play doesn't matter. This is the opportunity to go, okay, I got 15 seconds. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to put my eyes onto the flagpole, and then I'm going to lock back in on the play, right? But they're not doing that because everything's good until something goes bad. And now they're scrambling for the answers, and they're under stress, and their brain won't let them sort of cut through it. They're just going to be caught up in the emotion. Now the distractions come. Now an error comes. Now a bad at bat comes. I lose my command, whatever it is, because I was letting the stuff build up, and I wasn't cutting off that cycle, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until I bottomed out. Now I got to do something different.
You mentioned something that I think has a lot of parallels to coaching, and I think it has a lot of parallels with player development in particular. But like you talked about, you have kids that come in and they're so confident and they're so ready to go that they're willing to absorb anything you say. Those kids are easy to coach.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the other side of the scale, which is it's gotten so bad that just tell me what I need to do because I got to find a way to get out of this. And me and Keith have talked about this, that you run into some kids that have trouble taking coaching until it gets so bad that they finally come to you. Those kids become easy to coach. That middle 90%, what I found is that they need to have an epiphany moment at some point with something that you've given them. And whether it's a swing change or some sort of a cue that you give them, some sort of a verbal cue to kind of get them to do what you need them to do. And like from a player development standpoint, you need that kid to work hard for 6 weeks in the weight room and then max out and he goes, oh, wow, this really does work. And they get the bug for it. Is that kind of the same thing that you deal with from a mental side, where that middle 90%, you give them the tools and they almost need to have a breakthrough moment where they go, oh, wow, this does work. Now I can get into it.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. Actually, I had a kid what's tonight? Today's we're recording on Monday, last Wednesday, who's a Division III commit to a really good Division III program. He's a pitcher. And we were talking about getting prepared for the season to come, right? And we were kind of talking about like what he went through last year, because he was still like knee deep in the recruiting process. And so for him in the recruiting process, it was all velo, right? Like all he could think about was, I got to throw harder so that I can get noticed. And everything else sort of fell to the wayside. But with that, the mental side was a mess, because one, he was so focused on velocity that the nuance of being a pitcher went out the window, right? He wasn't thinking about any sort of, mental element to the game. It was just, how can I throw as hard as I can throw as fast as I can, so somebody says they want me because my radar gun reading hit X. I didn't start working with him until the end, after the high school season ended. So I was working with him basically in summer ball. And like, that was what I recognized with him. And I said, hey, you know what? You're just blowing your top out there. And like, the command is terrible. You don't have any way to reset yourself. He picked it up and got better as the summer went on, but now we're back getting ready for the school season. And we were working the other night, and he was telling me about his like winter throwing regimen, right? How's your winter stuff going? I feel great. I'm smooth. I'm commanding all my pitches. My focus has changed this winter because I'm not as focused on velocity. That's a great piece of awareness for a kid, right? I want to be a better pitcher because I don't have to worry about velocity. I said, that's great. I said, okay, but what's going to happen when you get on the field in a month? Like, everything's been going really smoothly. Like, what's your plan to deal with adversity? And he's like, I don't have one. And I'm like, did you have one last year? And he's like, no. That was the breakthrough. He saw the connection of like, the reason why I couldn't handle things last year is because I didn't really have a plan for how to deal with adversity. And we were talking about it. For him specifically, it was like, well, I'm like, well, what gets you kind of worked up? He's like, yeah, when I'm getting ready in the bullpen and my arm's a little wonky, right? I'm not 100%. I don't feel right. Now I start to think about, well, this is going to be a disaster because I'm not perfect. I said, okay, perfect. Great example. Now we need to have a plan for when you're 80 or 90% coming out of warmups onto the mound of how am I going to keep my focus on, I got to get guys out with what I have. How am I going to make sure I don't put the focus on the arm as the excuse and like fixate on that? Just accept it for what it is. But we got to have a plan. And he realized that he didn't have a plan. So when you get into a stressful situation, like you're pitching in a game and everything starts to speed up and you're freaking out, if you don't have a plan to stop the bleeding, pardon that pun, like if you don't have a plan to stop the cycle, you're done. You're going to get the hook and it's going to be over and it's going to start to spin so fast. So as much as I hate to put the idea in somebody's head when they're feeling good about themselves, like we've got to look out for adversity, that mental prep piece and the plan is so critical. What am I going to do when things aren't the way I want them to be? Now I have an answer already baked up and I'm ready to use it when I come out there and I'm not throwing as hard as I want, or my slider is a little flat, or whatever it is that gets me worked up. I know what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I would imagine if the kid went into the spring without that plan, as soon as he hit that piece of adversity, he's going to resort back to, let me see how hard I can throw this thing. And you're right back in it. It's funny that you bring this stuff up because we talk about it. We just did a podcast about body language. Every single coach that we talk to, when they come to evaluate a player that they've already, like, they're there because they think the kid's good. They're oftentimes not necessarily looking at the result because they're there for a reason, but they're looking at how does a kid react to failure? How does a kid respond to things that don't go his way? And we're talking about the exact same thing. And the kid who has a routine, and I want to get into some of this stuff, but the kid who has a routine or at least has a plan in place to hit that reset button, he's going to be able to, one, not only perform better, but he's also going to show the qualities that coaches really value because, it's inevitable that when you get into college, it's going to go sideways at some point. You're going to have a bad outing. You're going to have a stretch of at-bats where you feel like you're swinging at a pea and you couldn't hit water if you fell out of a boat. But how do you reset in those moments?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get back to being able to take a good at-bat at the back end of the game, even though you struck out 3 times? Like, can you bear down after you give up back-to-back doubles and keep it a 1-run inning? Like, those are the things that win in college baseball first and foremost, but they're things that coaches really hone in on. Once they figure out that you're good enough from a talent perspective, now they're trying to figure out, do you have the mental capacity? Do you have the mental toughness to be able to do that at the college level where it gets increasingly hard? But to talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you try to get your clients to put into practice and some basic stuff that our listeners can start to think about as they, listen to this and maybe some stuff they can incorporate into their routines.
Sure. I mean, the stuff that I'll share with you is not earth shattering, right? I just thinking about this. I mean, for me, number one has to be your breathing. It's always with you. It has so many benefits, right? When you're accessing the breathing the way you need to from your diaphragm, your stomach, right? It slows your heart rate down. It relaxes your muscles. And it tells your brain everything's going to be all right. Right. And there's so many times where I'll talk about my own experience as a player where I'd be holding my breath or I'd be clenching. I'd be grinding the handle of the bat down to sawdust because I was so tense, but I didn't realize it. Right. If you get into the habit of just taking those deep breaths between every pitch to really just kind of engage the side of the nervous system that you need to, that's just a great habit, by itself. Then it's okay, well, what do I put with it? Right. And I think for me, it's really about those kind of cues. I've heard some people call it, I think I call them identity cues or meaningful cues. How do you want to play the next pitch? Right. It has to be about your identity as a player, not hey, I got this. And that's fine for some kids. Right. But what's my identity as a player? And I want to find a way, like I have one kid who uses the phrase attack, dominate, win. Love it, right? Like that's like all process stuff. Attack, attack, attack. Great. Now I have that cue of reminding me, like, how do I want to play the next pitch, right? For some kids, I'll say, if you really want to access it and you have a hard time with it in the beginning, write it on your hand, stick it under the bill of your hat, right? Put it on your batting glove or on your glove. And, as a visual reminder of like, this is the way I want to redirect my attention after the last pitch, after a bad pitch or a bad play. How do I want to show up and play that next pitch? So there might be a little bit of training wheels that has to go in there, right? Don't be afraid to do that. I rarely see kids do this, but I do suggest it. Keep a journal, man. Stick a notebook in your backpack and like break down in a bat just a couple of sentences when it's over, so you can reflect on, you know what, like I might have struck out, but I spit on a really good pitch that was off the plate. I didn't chase it. Like I had good swings. I hit one straight back. I was on it, right? Like reflecting on the at-bats or as a pitcher, right? Like I made some good pitches. Maybe I got squeezed a little bit, but I executed my pitches, right? So starting to focus on like, hey, did I do my part? Did I do something well, even though I got a bad result? I mean, I talk to kids all the time about like, sometimes you just get beat in this game, right? If you execute a good pitch or someone breaks off a good pitch on you and you get beat, like that's okay. Right. It's not an indictment of who you are as a player. And to go back to your example about like college coaches watching, I talk to kids about this in summer ball all the time. It's like, listen, every coach that's out there watching you almost, without, exception, played baseball. They know what it's like to have our day. If you go for 3 and you're kicking helmets and you're MFing your teammates and you're MFing the umpire, they're going to go, this kid's not going to hold up, in college. And I don't want to coach that kid because when he has a bad day, I'm going to be the guy that has to deal with it. Right. And so I would rather take the kid who's maybe even not as good ability wise, but I know what I'm going to get every single day because he can carry himself like a professional and he can take care of himself. He's not going to embarrass my program and I don't have to babysit him. Right. So if you go 0 for 3, but you take it like a man, you pick up your teammates, you play good in the field, you run hard, coach is going to go, you know what? It was a bad day for that kid. I've had those bad days. But he handled himself like a pro. And I think kids do understand that intellectually. It's a little harder when they're in the recruiting cycle, but like all you can do is just continue to reinforce those messages so that they start to buy into the consistency of it.
The result can cloud the good, especially in baseball, especially on the offensive side. Like you can do everything right in it being out, and that stat line doesn't necessarily reflect the quality of your play a lot of times. And I think that that's important for kids to be able to take a step back. And I love the idea of just taking a couple notes. You get done with an at bat because to your point, you can have a really quality at bat and get a result that in the box score doesn't look like a great result, but it's a 7 pitch at bat that ended up with a hard hit ball, or you spit on a couple good breaking balls and you took a pitch that might have been off the plate a little bit, but like the at bat as a whole was good enough. And instead of taking that as like, oh well, that was an 0 for 1, being able to go back and reflect on like, hey, I did some good stuff. I kind of just need to keep doing that, even though I didn't get the result. Stick with what you do well.
Exactly.
Try to reinforce that. I love that idea, and I think that I've seen some guys do it. I haven't seen a lot of guys do it. Had some guys at William and Mary that were really good at being able to come in after an at bat and then just take kind of a moment by themselves. They'd go sit towards the end of the bench, take 30 seconds, just kind of process it all, and then move on.
Flush it. Yep.
It wasn't a coincidence that those were usually the better hitters, because they did have the ability to not just view it in the term of a result, but also like understand that they did some things well. They just may not have gotten the result that they were looking for. But the funny thing is about those kids is that a lot of them would do the same thing if the result was really good.
Yeah. I love that. And that's the perfect world for me, right? Like stick to your process no matter what the result is. Because listen, there's always going to be times where you might have to like reevaluate your process too. Like let's not be naive, right? You can have a process and it might not work for you after a while. But most of these kids will be like, okay, I have a process. They'll have one bad day and they'll want to throw it out the window, just like their mechanics. That's why I tell kids all the time. I'm like, you're in the cage or you're on the mound all winter working on the same mechanical stuff, right? Your mechanics are not bad unless they are, but usually they feel really good. And then they break down in a game, not because the mechanics are not sound. It's because the mental is having an effect on the way your body's executing the movement. I'm under stress. When I get tense, now all of a sudden I'm a little bit tighter. That might screw up my swing, versus like, hey, I've been practicing this for months. I feel really, really good. I don't need to make a mechanical adjustment after one or two bad at bats. I need to just trust that it's okay and be patient. And that patience part, whether it's in the recruiting process or on the field, it's also something that kids really struggle with, being patient.
Yeah, the patience is paramount for people. Like, it's in a world where we want things to happen immediately. It's the recruiting process doesn't, and neither does, honestly, when you get to college, there's outliers that are freshmen that are going to play a lot. Like the likelihood is you're probably not ready to play at that level consistently. You're recruited and you're there because they believe your skill set and what you can do is requisite for what they want. But you still might be a tick below what it is to get on the field all the time. And I think that's really hard for people to wrap their heads around, especially kids. And then, you get into the results driven stuff like, I hit 0.074 in the fall. Like, yeah, but how were your at bats overall? And what were you doing? Like, yeah, if you punched out 47 times, it's probably an issue and we have some stuff we got to do, but I used to tell my kids all the time, and I've said it on here before, like I love this game. There's a reason that I've been in it for so long, but like it's a stupid game when you break down to its core. Like you have a guy throwing a ball into an imaginary zone with an arbitrary dude who tells you whether it's good or not. And then you're trying to hit it with a stick and you don't get anything if you hit it, right? Like unless you hit it out of the yard. Like you still have to touch 4 bases to score a run. Like it's not like basketball where you throw it in the hoop, you got points, or you score a goal, like whatever. Like you could do everything right, like Andy said, and like not get a hit. And it's hard for people. Like, and then on the same hand, you can get sawed off and shatter your bat and flip it over the first baseman and end up with a double. And you're like, this is such a dumb game. And it's the same thing on the pitching side, right? Like you could make a great pitch and it gets hit.
Yep.
Like, And I think like that's where kids really, especially younger kids, struggles. It's like that's the best slider I've thrown all day, and he just hit it for a single. Like, yeah, man, that's just this game. Like, balls get hit, balls get put in play, guys make errors, and that's where like this process and everything you're talking about comes into play for a lot of guys. Where I think that they either A, they don't necessarily recognize it, or B, they don't realize that they need something like that. And I do think some of the, there's a lot of people out there that have process that probably don't even realize they have a legit process. Like and it could be anything. Like, they make an error and they look in their glove and, spit in it and punch their glove and then they move on to the next play, like whatever it is. But like, I've noticed I would call them like ticks, but like I noticed those things in guys that played for me where like I don't think they realize that that's something that they do, but like that's their mechanism to clear whatever just happened to move on to the next play. And the kids that don't have something like that are generally the ones that they carry that air into their next at bat, or they carry that bad at bat into the field. And like, then it just snowballs. We've all seen it. It just snowballs. It's like, man, you're hitting in the 7th in a big spot and you're still worried about the at bat in the 2nd. Like it's time to turn the page. Like we got to do something in order to turn the page so that we're present in that at bat so that we can do what we need to do in order to find success.
Gotta be.
So we talk about some stuff that like the breathing piece, I think is really important. And that's become a really prevalent thing in terms of like kind of a baseline foundation of being able to kind of get yourself back into the moment. And there's stuff that you can do in kind of the emergency break glass, like stuff's going bad, hit the reset button. How do you think routine and process prior to all of this plays in, right? Like you've got the in-game moments, right, where you need that safety net. You need the ability to wash it out, to hit the reset button, whatever term you want to use. But like anything else, I would imagine that there's steps in a process that you can put in play far beyond that, that create a sense of confidence, that allow a kid to feel like he is prepared for that moment. Is that something that you stress with clients? Like I go back to pitchers and their routine on how they prepare themselves for the game so that when they go out for the first pitch, I'm ready to go.
Mhm.
And I know that I've done everything that I can leading up to that start. So now I can just go and compete. Do you find
Yeah.
that to be true? Is that something you stress with your clients?
100%. Yeah. And listen, I really try to be as honest and realistic and pragmatic with my clients as possible, right? Like you're never going to replicate game stress in any other situation, right? So like to think that anything you do before you get onto the mound in a big game, right? I've got kids, who've come from high school, they're freshmen pitching, at Florida State. I had one kid who pitched to Florida State not too long ago. Like there's 7,000 people there. You've never done that. Like it's unreasonable to think that you're going to master that experience in terms of the way you manage yourself, even if you have the best process in the world. However, just like any other skill you develop, right? I talk about this all the time. You've got to practice that skill, right? So like the most advanced, most mature players get that, right? So I work with one guy who pitches in minor league baseball, and I knew him in college, and he has the same routine every single pitch, mental routine. He goes through, flush the last pitch, take a deep breath, tell myself to go attack, go, I'm ready to go, right? That's his kind of 4-step process for filtering out the last pitch. He does it in catch play. He does it in flat ground. He does it in bullpen. He's getting as many mental reps using that routine as possible so that when he gets into a stressful situation, it's muscle memory, right? To use a, kind of a colloquial term. He has the practice. He's got it rep down. Like I know how to get myself off of that last pitch. I'm going to reset myself this way versus, hey, this is my process, but I don't practice it all in between my outings, or I don't practice it all in between games, or I don't practice it all in the cage when I'm hitting off the jugs machine. I just try to show up in the game and do it. The odds go way down that you're going to be able to access it when you need it, right? So it's like anything else. It's just trying to, like, for me, one of my biggest challenges, one of the biggest jobs I have is trying to tell that story to a kid so that they can connect the dots, right? Like, hey, I get it, right? Like when I was learning how to do this physical thing, I couldn't have, applied it in the game if I didn't practice it 1,000 times before. Or I don't go to the weight room once a month, right? Or I don't go to the weight room on game day to get strong. I'm in there 5 days a week because it's a process and I have to be patient. It takes time. The same thing applies to the mental, but it's just not coached that way. And that's nobody's fault. I think it's a resource issue, right? Whether you don't have the time to stress it. If you're a high school coach, in college, you might have an on-campus resource, but like kids, not everybody wants to use mental skills. That's the other thing we could talk about. Whether it's pros or college, like you're only getting a small portion of the kids that opt into it, right? Like you might get 10 or 20% of the kids who say, hey, I really want to try this mental thing. And 80 or 90% go like, I don't need that, until they need it. But most of them don't, right? So it's like, you can't force them to do it like anything else.
Yeah, and that's tough because, and I think at times it's the same way with the physical development, is that you have kids that are so successful doing, I don't want to say the bare minimum, but they're not required to be in the weight room 5 days a week. They already throw hard. They've had a ton of success not doing a lot, but eventually it's going to either catch up to you or you're going to need it. And I think the mental side of it for young kids, it seems like, and I don't want to diminish it, but it seems like it's low hanging fruit where if you can get involved in this, you're just giving yourself an edge. And, if you're a player or a parent out there listening right now, if you have the means and you have access to somebody that can help your son or your daughter just become more mentally prepared to deal with adversity, maybe it's just a boost in confidence. Maybe it's just they feel better about going into a game because they feel like they have some tools. I don't think it's any different than walking onto a field and knowing like I'm big and I'm strong and I'm capable. You also want to have something on the mental side to be able to balance that, because specifically in a sport like baseball, it's inevitable that you're going to go through some moments. You're going to kick a ball. You're going to have a couple really bad at bats. You're going to give up some home runs. And if you're 16 years old and you're 17 years old and you're starting to get some of this into your repertoire, it's only going to make you better on the field. But I think long-term, just as a human, it gives you the ability to take a step back and take a deep breath and kind of survey the situation and not let emotion run in. So anybody who's out there listening, if you're kind of lukewarm on the idea of a mental skills coach, if you have the means to do it, I only think it can be a positive. I don't think at any point it's going to have a negative impact on anybody. And there's a reason that a lot of college programs up and down college sports are integrating mental training into what they do. You'll see some of it on Twitter, but you get to some of the bigger programs in college baseball right now, they have a mental performance coach. Mm-hmm. It's not by accident. It's not voodoo stuff. Like, this is tried and true, and it gives these kids a tool that helps them be the best version of themselves as frequently as possible.
Yeah, I think, and I couldn't have wrote that commercial better myself. I mean, you're absolutely right about that, Andy. I think the other thing that I've learned doing this is it also gives kids an outlet, right? It gives them an opportunity to talk. It's not always about the skill. It's about the ability to sort of just verbalize some of the like angst that they're feeling, because they don't necessarily feel like they can talk to their coach about it. Whether that's valid or not, they perceive that to be true, right? Like, I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. I'm in a slump. I don't feel right. I'm not thinking right. Well, I don't want to go to my coach because my coach is going to hold it against me, or they're going to say, hey, this guy can't hack it mentally, so we're going to take him out of the lineup or whatever, which is probably not true. Again, every coach has played the game. Listen, some people don't buy into it as much as others, but it just gives the kid to get into the habit of, hey, I can talk about this with somebody else and it's not going to kill me, right? Because one of the conversations I have a lot, maybe you guys have a point of view on this, is, eventually if the anxiety that's associated with you not playing, or you not understanding what your role is on a team, or understanding why things are happening, the door is always open for you to go have a conversation with your coach, right? And I think a lot of kids feel like they can't do it. Now, I'm not saying you have one bad weekend or you're not playing, you start knocking on the door and complaining that you're not playing. There's a way to have that conversation. But I think there's a lot of kids who get a lot of performance anxiety because they're like, well, I have no idea where I stand. Why aren't I playing? And now they're kind of just bottled up about it. And now that exacerbates, it sort of cranks up the pressure in the pressure cooker. Then the lid blows, because it's like, I just imagine every possible conceivable outcome. My coach doesn't like me. They're going to cut me. They're going to, I'm not going to play all season. And now all of a sudden it just becomes this big pressure cooker that they can't get themselves out of.
Yeah, I think it's a tough conversation to have, but I think anyone nowadays who's coaching should have at least the self-awareness to know that sometimes, implied or not, you are giving, you're putting stress on your kids. And sometimes, like, you might not think that you are, but you are. And other times I do think that it is, I don't want to say made up, but it's the kids put more into it than what, like, they're perceiving it to be a lot worse than what it likely is. Like, I had two quick stories. We had, my first job is that when I became the head coach at RPI, when I was an assistant, I wandered the dugout the entire time because I was moving guys and doing stuff. When I became a head coach, I still did the same thing. And after my first year, my assistant was like, dude, you got to stop moving. You make everybody nervous. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Like he's like, I'm just telling you right now, like the guys have said it to me, like you make everyone nervous because you're constantly moving. And I was like, whew, okay. So like, it was hard for me, but I had to just sit my ass on a bucket or a chair and just try to coach from there. And like, it was very hard, but I noticed a distinct difference in how we played when I was just sitting there and just letting it go instead of, I wasn't doing anything that would make them nervous. It was just my presence walking through the dugout that was doing it. And it was an eye opener for me. And I remember I think it was 21. We had a guy who graduated last year, Joey Saya, who I actually talked about him on another podcast recently. Super talented kid, but like, you'd put him in and, he tried so hard instead of letting the game come to him and just let his athletic ability take over. So he'd go in, like he was trying to hit a double, and it looked like he was trying to hit a double or a home run in every at bat. And it was like, dude, you just let your athleticism take over. You'll be fine. Like you're a 6'7" runner. You can't strike out 60% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not doing anybody any good. And, it took me pulling him aside and having the conversation where, it's similar to what you're talking about, where he's just like, I feel like every time to go in order for me to stay in the lineup, I have to go 4 for 4. And I was like, that's like, when have I ever told you that you need to go 4 for 4 in order to stay in the lineup? Like we don't talk about results. We talk about, putting together good at bats and, going with the flow of the game of how you hey, if we got to climb pitches early, we like whatever the pitcher's giving us, we're going to take. If we can chase him in 3 because we scored 9 runs, awesome. If we chase him in 3 because he throws a ton of pitches, whatever. And he was like, well, I guess I was like, right. So like, I think it was like for him, it was a little bit more perceived. Like I needed him to go 4 for 4 all the time. But until we had that conversation, it was like that aha moment of like, oh, I don't need to go 0 for 4 every time. I just need to put together good at bats in order for me to continue to be in the lineup. And but I think it's eye opening for coaches because I think, you can quickly forget sometimes what it's like to be a student athlete. And I think the other side of it is that, your window as a player is so finite. Like you only get 4 years to go. Well, if we have COVID again, we'll have like 15 years that you can play college baseball. But under normal circumstances, like you only get 4 years. Because coaches, you get to wake up and do it for as long as you want to do it. Like I coached for 16 years. It was just, and I played. So that's 20 years of baseball that I just got to, like I woke up and I was doing college baseball every day for 20 years. And I think sometimes like you forget that like you can take for granted sometimes that it is such a finite window and they put so much pressure on themselves to succeed that there has to be some sort of an outlet or the mental skill side. And I think the same thing that, Andy pitched it far better than I will. But I also think that like, even if you don't think it's worth it, I think it's just like it's any other form of coaching where you might not love every single thing, but there might be 1 or 2 things that you can pick up on of like, oh, wow, like that is me. Like I can do like, here's a routine that I can take, or yeah, when I get into stressful situations, this happens to me. What can I do? Like it might not be the whole thing, but I can certainly promise you that it's going to help. And I think the journal idea is great. There was a guy, he's talked about it with my players too. Like Kyle Dake was a 4-time national champion at Cornell in wrestling. 4-time national champion in 4 different weight classes. First guy to ever do it. In his freshman year, he got a notebook and he wrote in there, 141 national champion every night before he went to bed. Did it. Sophomore year, he got another notebook. He wrote it in the morning when he woke up and before he went to bed, 2nd-time national champion, so on and so forth. So junior year, he did it 3 times. Senior did it 4 times. It was just like the mental toughness you have to be to wrestle, and let alone be a 4-time national champion is super high. But I always thought that was interesting that like maybe he didn't believe that he was that good when he started. But just that constant reiteration of like, this is what I'm going to do. And this is what do I need to do in order to achieve this? And it might just be that, right? Like I'm going to hit 300, like whatever it might be, something that small, I think can make huge differences for kids when they get to that level. Because I think sometimes you get caught up in like, I'm not as good as Andy. And you start looking around and comparing yourself to teammates, and like realistically, like, man, you're here for a reason. Like, you're good enough. You just have to believe it and go do it. And I think even if just believing it, writing something down to believe it can make an astronomical difference for kids in their confidence and what they can do from a baseball standpoint.
Absolutely.
Or really anything.
Yeah, writing things down just you get out of your head, right? But like, I think even what's more important there, Keith, is what you said is like, when I coach a kid, like if they latch on to one thing, I'm going to focus on that one thing and make sure they do that one thing consistently and well, versus being like, okay, we're working on breathing and this is really helping you, but now I'm going to layer in 10 other things to complicate the situation. No, if that works for you, you got to find a way to keep doing it. So I'm going to hold you accountable to that. Let's find a system or a process that allows you to like get good at doing that all the time versus, hey, that worked well for you for a bit. Now let's add 5 other things where you get confused, right? Like, and I think sometimes we do, like, I think mental skills coaches, like any other profession, any other coach, sometimes we kind of take ourselves too seriously in the sense that like, oh, we've got to do all these different skills because we have them. But really it's about figuring out what makes a kid tick and going, okay, that resonates with him. Let's just keep doing it, right? If I write in a notebook every single night, national champion, and that works for me and that builds my confidence, and that's the only thing I need to do, just do it. Just don't stop doing it, right? Versus like, okay, let's take that and do 5 other things. And now all of a sudden it waters it down. And I think we do kind of fight that urge sometimes.
Yeah, I think that holds true with coaching skills and coaching players, is that the end goal for every player that you try to develop doesn't really change, right? You're trying to find a way to unlock their ability.
Mm-hmm.
How you go about it is, I think, what is really important in understanding that each kid is going to be a different use case. And I didn't figure this out until probably like 6 or 7 years into coaching, where you have to coach each kid differently. And verbiage that you use for one specific cue might not click for one kid. And finding a way to get to that answer differently for each kid. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing, that like, if you get to know the kid, if you understand what makes them tick, you can give them one thing that can unlock it. And it's a hard thing to learn, but it's an important thing to learn from a coaching perspective, is that you can't treat everybody the same. You can't coach everybody the same. You can have principles, right? And you can have expectations that go across the team, but certain guys react differently to certain types of coaching, different cues, different ways you communicate with them. Some guys, the best thing you can do is not coach them. Just let them play. Make sure that you're there for them when they need extra reps and all that kind of stuff. And then there's some guys that you need to be really, really in lockstep with to make sure that they're staying on top of what they need to stay on top of. But I want to go back to the piece where you're talking about some of the conversations. I think that it's hard for kids to be vulnerable. I think it's hard for everybody to be vulnerable. And you're talking about the kid who is struggling a little bit and how it's hard to go to your coach. And I think that's completely understandable, because it almost can come off as a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody wants to be, especially in athletics, nobody wants to be perceived as weak or as vulnerable. So having that outlet, whether it's a pitching coach or a hitting coach or a mental skills coach, but somebody that you can go to and say, hey, I'm struggling a little bit right now, and not feel like you're going to get judged or not feel like it's going to have an impact on your ability to play. I think that's important to have that outlet, whether it's, like I said, it could be a variety of different people. Hopefully it's the guy who's coaching you.
Right.
Right. Like I always hope, and I hope that the guys that I had a chance to coach, specifically later in my career where I felt like I was a lot more comfortable in my skin and who I was as a coach and how I wanted to communicate with kids, I hope that they can look back and feel like they can come to me in those moments. They're like, hey, I'm struggling right now. Like, can we sit down and talk some of this out? But that's still a really hard step for young kids to take. And those conversations can be difficult. And I think all coaches have that open door policy. I think some coaches are better at kind of enforcing that policy and making it very comfortable for a kid to walk into the office on a random Monday and be like, hey, what do I got to do to get in the lineup? And they might not hear what they want to hear, but at least they know if they're walking in that door, they're going to get information that's going to point them in the right direction.
Exactly. And that's exactly the conversation I have with them. There's so much anxiety that's built up because they don't feel like they understand. At least if you go have the conversation, the number one thing I hear from any athlete who says, I went to go talk to my coach about something that was bothering me, is they say they felt relief, right? I didn't love the answer, but now I know what I need to do, or now I know why. I could stop like playing the tape in my head over and over and over again. Right. And so, but here's the other thing, like, in fairness to coaches, this is something that a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old kid doesn't really have the ability to do that well, is to be able to put themselves in their coach's shoes. Hey, I'm dealing with administration. I'm dealing with admissions. I'm dealing with recruiting. I'm dealing with donors. I'm dealing with A, B, C, D, all this stuff. And it's not because they don't want to coach you and they don't want to help you. It's because they only have so much bandwidth, right? And so if you need to get something addressed, then in some cases, it's got to be your responsibility because it's your career. To go back to what you were saying, right? The thing I'll talk to kids about is like, hey, you don't have to go talk to your coach. But if this thing that's in your mind is eating you up, like the kid that Keith was talking about, is eating you up so much that you think you have to go 4 for 4 every night, and you're telling yourself these stories, the only way you're going to get over that in some instances is to go knock on the door and have a conversation. So would you rather have the discomfort of having the conversation, or would you rather sit there kind of like just completely ruminating on whatever story you've created in your head and be like, you know what, I'm going to, and it starts to affect your performance. Do you want to play good on the field? Okay, get it off your chest. If you want to wear it, but it's going to hurt you. So that's that motivation piece where they start to understand, like, I'd rather go have the hard conversation rather than kind of try to figure it out myself. And one of the things I would do with a kid there is, okay, let's role play it. Let's play it out. One, you got to frame the conversation in a way that's not like just, hey, me, right? How do I contribute? A lot of kids want to just be contributors, right? Like, how do I add something to this team and not just stand in the dugout and take up space? Okay, how can I contribute, coach? Like, what can I do to help the team? That's a lot better question than like, where am I at bats? Right. And then think about how you're going to prepare for that answer. You don't know what's coming back, but you could say, like, you know what? I just don't think you're ready yet. You know, okay, how's it going to make you feel? It's going to make you feel mad, angry, sad, whatever. Okay, take a deep breath and go, okay, coach, I understand, and have your follow-up ready, or go, yes, I get it. I got my information. Yeah, that was uncomfortable, but now I did my part. And I had this conversation with a high school kid who's going to be a senior this year. And I said to him, even if you go into that conversation with your coach and you don't hear what you like and you don't get the result that you want, it's going to build character, which is a lot harder to sell than anything. But you're preparing yourself for the rest of your life. When you go into the office and talk to your boss, like, you've already done it once before, right? You're building that character of like, I have the courage to go in and talk to like a man, to my coach, and say, hey, like, I just want to talk to you about what's going on here, versus I'm going to hide from that conversation and let it eat me alive.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things too, from the coach's side of things, is getting and I think it's talked about all the time, but like getting the kids to also understand that your opportunity is every day in practice and scrimmages and all the like, right? Like, and I think, and this happens every year, there's probably already been thousands of these conversations, but like, you go through game 1 or week 1 and like, you have 5 kids that want to talk on Monday. Like, hey, why didn't I play? It's like, well, that did you not see? Like, are you not there with me watching what happened? Like, you struggled all off season. You struggled all in the lead up. Like, this guy, I think, outplayed you to this point. Like, after 4 at bats for that guy is a tough conversation. Come in and be like, well, I think I'm better than him. Like, okay, like, you haven't showed it for 27 days. Like, you don't get to just, and I think from a coaching standpoint, you look at it like, you don't just get to watch a guy have a bad day or a couple days and then come in and be like, well, I'm better. I want his at bats. Like, well, you should have done that for the first 6 weeks of practice, not come in here and talk about it on day one. And I think sometimes it, like, from a coaching standpoint, it can get, I don't want to say combative, but like you're thinking about that of like, well, where was this fire for the last 6 weeks? And that can, and I think like kids who have some sort of process or the ability to be able to self-assess that, like there, you might not have that conversation week one. Like that might be a week 3 or 4 conversation. Like, hey, what more do I need to do in order to get at bats and help contribute to this team? Versus after day one, like, why am I not playing? Like, well, I can only play 9 guys, and I rolled out the best 9 that I thought have showed up for consistently for the last 6 weeks. And I think that like, but I still like it takes a semblance of courage to do it. I completely agree. I just think sometimes like it gets lost in the shuffle, especially with younger players, because it's like, well, I was the dude at my high school team. Like, you're not a dude anymore. And, you know, you need to, you know, we had someone we interviewed, the podcast not out yet, but like he put it as best I've heard it. Like, you know, the consistency is what coaches are looking for. Mm-hmm. Like, your floor and your ceiling have to be close together in order for me to put you in the lineup all the time, because I know what I'm going to get. And if you go 4 for 4, awesome. But I know if you go 0 for 4, you're taking 4 really good at bats. He could go 0 for 4 with 4 punches. He also could lose 3 balls. But I don't know what guy's going to show up today. And I think that it was the best way that I've heard it put. And I think it's something that kids have to understand when you get to college, of like that consistency. It's not always the outcome or the result. It's the consistency of what I can trust when I write a lineup to give us the best opportunity to win.
Exactly. That's the word, right? Trust. I think it's really hard for kids to understand this, but I talk about it all the time. If a coach trusts a player, they may not be as good as you are, but if the coach knows exactly what you said, Keith, if the coach knows what they're getting, because they're human beings, right? Like, I want to win games, right? And I want to know that whatever I'm getting is going to be the same day in, day out in terms of effort, attitude, approach, all those things. If you're all over the map, I can't trust you. Like, the coach has their prerogative to choose that. And as a player, you've got to accept that, right? And here's the thing, being in the space that you're in with recruiting, do you feel like kids, like the word I've heard used is de-recruited, right? They get that warm and fuzzy feeling in recruiting, and then they show up on campus, and now they're in fall ball as a freshman, and they've got to prove themselves. And it's almost like they're confused about it, that they can't really like make sense of the fact that, like, hey, now I got to compete for my spot. You're not telling me all the good things you told me the last 1 or 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think it's similar. I'll let Andy expound on it, because I think he does a very good job articulating it. I think one of the hardest things that kids don't understand when they set foot on a college campus is that your main competition is actually your teammates and not the guys in the other dugout.
Yeah, I think that there's always a little bit of a culture shock when guys get on campus, right? And it can come in a variety of ways. You're balancing a lot more stuff that you're not used to balancing. I think the first 6 months that guys are on campus oftentimes can kind of determine the trajectory that they're going to have as a career. In my personal experience, most guys who are acclimated and are ready to compete and don't expect anything to be handed to them, those guys tend to have pretty good careers. But I think that, to Keith's point, for so long, you don't have any competition in your own dugout. You're always going to be in the lineup. And now you get to a college campus, and the shortstop who's ahead of you is a junior or hit 330 the year before. You think you're a shortstop, and you lose sight of the fact that, like, you just need to compete every day, and that you could play second, you could play third. And I think that's a big adjustment for kids to understand that the only time that the competition is in the other dugout is on game day. Every other day, you're competing against the guys on your team, and it's a constant back and forth of guys having to prove themselves, right? And when you're a freshman, you have no capital because you've never done anything. And in order to build that capital, you need to recognize that competition a lot of times it's not the other team. And it's definitely not the other team when you get there. But that transition can be tough. And I think that the other thing that kids have a tough time separating is the recruiting process and then the competition process. And they're recruiting you to be there because they want you to be in that environment. But it's up to you to prepare yourself to be in that environment. Coaches, the best compliment a kid can get is that you're low maintenance, right? And to Keith's point, there's trust, there's consistency. I know what I'm going to get. Like that kid is the guy that you want in your program because he's going to show up. He's going to do all the things that he's supposed to be doing. Freshmen sometimes can get caught up in that. And there's also the transition to learning how to practice at the college level, which can be a steep learning curve because most guys have never experienced what the intensity of a college practice is like. Like your high school game that you played in, that doesn't have the same intensity as a inter squad scrimmage at the Division I level or Division II, whatever level it is. Like there's heightened competition and there's heightened stresses when you get on that campus. But the disconnect between the warm and fuzzies you get in the recruiting process, what I would say to kids who are listening to this is the recruiting process is over when you get onto campus. Now it's your job to put that coach in a situation where he's got to put you in the lineup. And that's something you have to earn. You got to take it. And I don't want to say it's that simple, but I think that the preparation to get on campus, I think really helps kids. It shortens that learning curve. And understanding what you're getting into. And the mental side of things is a big part of that. Because that first fall, and you're a freshman, you're playing against 22, 23-year-old men. You're 18. Some of those guys if you're a pitcher, you might be throwing to somebody who's got 600 college at-bats. I mean, he is way better prepared for that moment than you are. It's inevitable that you're going to have some struggles, but if you're mentally capable of handling that, you're in such a better position than the kid who walks in there all, butterflies and flowers and thinks that it's just going to be a fun time to play college baseball. College baseball is awesome. It's incredibly fun, but it's also really difficult. And it requires a certain amount of toughness, both mental and physical, to be able to show up every day.
Yeah. And the thing that we haven't really talked about, and I think you've mentioned it a couple times, Andy, is like being in the present moment, right? Like, and that's where really the ability to compete happens, right? You're not thinking about anything else but like, hey, let me go get this guy out, right? And let me just fully commit. That's a big word that I use with players. Commit to whatever it is you're doing, right? If you fully commit to the next pitch and the guy hits it 400 feet, well, then you committed to the pitch, right? You competed and he beat you. Like that's what sports are about. That's what baseball is about. You're going to get beat, right? But if you can show up and be completely present and commit and be like, you know what? I'm going to give you my best pitch and you beat me. I'm going to get the ball back. I'm going to wipe the rubber and come back at you again. And I think that's hard. And so like one of the things I think is important is for kids to practice mindfulness. That's a big thing I do as well. Like, hey, let's get on the meditation train here and do some stuff, get some reps, 5 minutes a day, every day, just getting comfortable with the way your mind works so that when you're in that, you're on the mound by yourself, where your mind's going and you can bring it back to, hey, let's go commit and make a pitch. Commit and make a pitch. That's the only one I got. Forget about the last one and forget about the next one. I'm not saying that's easy, but it's absolutely attainable. And it's a goal that kids can strive for if they want to do the work. You can't be out here thinking about 3 batters later, or you can't be thinking about the last ball that got hit on you because you can't compete, right? Like what, the joke is, right? The best baseball players are the ones who aren't very smart because they're not thinking about anything. They're just going out and hitting the ball or they're throwing the ball and they're not worried about anything except doing what they're doing. That's something that has to be practiced for some kids. And if you're not doing it, you're not going to be able to compete. Because you have to compete. You have to have fun doing it at times, even if it doesn't feel good.
Yeah, I think the compete aspect is one of the things, and like it's valued in the recruiting process because Andy and I talk about this all the time on here and with our clients, like you're opting into an uber competitive environment. And if you're by nature not competitive, like it's going to be tough. Or if you're like, you don't necessarily understand the level of competition that you're opting into to go play college baseball, because it's against your own teammates, against other teams. And a lot of the time it's against yourself. Like what do I have to do in order to get myself prepped to go play? And, it's the weight room, it's the extra swings in the cages, it's the dry mound stuff. Like it's a whole slew of things in order for you to be able to go do that. And I think that it's something that needs to be practiced, but also like you need to understand it. And I think until you kind of live it, it's hard to kind of really understand what it's like. And I do think that that's where a lot of freshmen kind of get jammed up in their first fall. Like it's an eye-opening experience. It is culture shock because it's like, like I was a guy who didn't really have to compete to win a job in high school or in travel ball or my entire life. And now I'm not the best shortstop on this team. Like I'm not even the second best shortstop or the backup second baseman. Like what do I need to do that? And, the kids that understand and can really compete. And, I always use like compartmentalize, what you need to do in order to be able to achieve that are the ones that I think generally find a lot of success. And, it is a shock. Like we had a guy who played for me, and then he played for one of Andy and I's best friend out at San Francisco. And when he finished up, he was like, I've never played for two more competitive people, but it helped me because I never knew how competitive this was going to be. And being able to be coached by people who are competitive helped me understand what this is. And it's not just I'm not patting my own back. It's just like an example of like, he's like, I had no idea. This is an all region kid who finished playing Division I baseball and had a lot of success. Like he was just like, it was eye opening to me what this actually was. I just thought it was going to be like, oh, I'm going to go play college baseball and it's fun. And it was like, whoa, this is a shock. And this is like, he's uber competitive. He was a 4-year starter for us on the mound. Like, again, all region guy who finished playing Division I baseball and had success. Like you don't get to that not being an uber competitive kid who can actually go, raise the bar and be able to find success there with the character that he had. Ryan Derby, Andy, is who I'm talking about, who like, our guy, Eric loved, so I think it's something that, again, like I think as coaches, sometimes we forget what it's like to be in that position. And, I think you try to coach it into them as best you can, but I don't necessarily think that we're all equipped with the requisite skills to be able to manage everybody in those situations. And it gets tough because I think sometimes your freshmen it takes a little while to figure out what gets them to tick. And they are a little bit more intimidated because, they've always been like, the coach tells them to stand on their head, and it's like, okay, I'm going to stand on my head. Like it was like uncoaching that out of guys sometimes of like, please don't be a yes man. Like, I need you. Like, if you don't understand, please say like, yo, Glass, I don't get what you're saying. What does that mean? Don't just regurgitate what I said. Like, have a little bit of thought process here. And as they get older, they start to understand. And then then you can have, you start to understand what makes them tick, and you can really help them, because if you just tell me, yeah, I get it, and you don't, like, I'm thinking you understand it because you just told me you did. And I think that's tough for some kids to really to grow into their own skin and be able to say that to coaches, because their whole life it's just been like, well, you do what coach says. And I'm not saying go against it, but like, it's fine to ask questions. Like, and that's the biggest complaint you hear out of coaches now. Like, they got to know why. Like, yeah, but there's nothing wrong with that. Like, they should know why, because if you're explaining it and maybe you're doing a bad job of explaining it, like, explain it better or say it in a different way. Like that's what coaching is, and I think that's where that was one of the disconnects I had with some of my younger kids early on, was just like, yo, please don't be a yes man. Just, if you don't understand, please ask. But you have to foster that environment as well.
Yeah, when they understand why they're doing something, they're going to be more motivated to do it, right? And that helps everybody, right? And like I think the part about like encouraging them to ask questions too is like that's something that I would talk about with a player is like, you come in at 18, do you want to be the best player on the team at 18 or do you want to keep getting better, right? That requires you to learn. That requires asking questions, collecting information, trying new things and making mistakes, right? And if you're not willing to do that, you only want to be seen as perfect or you want to be seen as sort of judged as this one thing, you're not going to make it because everybody's got to get better. And if you're not willing to stick your neck out and learn stuff and ask questions and try stuff and make a fool out of yourself and get better, then you're going to get left behind. And I think a lot of kids do struggle with that because they're only used to being told they're the best. They are so wonderful. You throw so hard. You know, you're this, that, and the other thing. And then you get to college and everybody's just as good as you are. So how are you going to handle it? Right? Like that. And listen, there's a whole nother element to that, right? Like as coaches, I'm sure you know this, right? What do they say? You're recruiting the family, right? Like the family stuff is a part of it. What are the parents saying to the kid? What are they learning in the household, right? What have they been told for the last 18 years? That's hard to undo in a semester or two or three or four, because that's like the way they've been wired. And so it's like, okay, like now I know what I'm working with. And it's really hard to like get them to listen to me because they only have heard it one way for the last however many years.
The family piece is interesting because it's a question that we get with every kid that we work with. Coaches who are interested, guys that we talk to, once they figure out a kid's good enough, they're asking about other stuff than the physical. What kind of kid am I getting? Is he resilient? Is he tough? Does he work hard? Like, do I have to light a fire under his ass to get him to do stuff, or is he a self-motivator? But almost without fail, we get a question like, how are mom and dad? What's that relationship like? And I think that, you know, how kids are treated at home oftentimes can bleed into when they get to college. And sometimes there's an adjustment period to exactly what you're talking about, is that just because a coach doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies when you get on campus, it doesn't mean that he doesn't care.
Right.
Right. And that's the hard part about being a coach. Like going back to the conversations you have with kids, there's no coach in the country that likes having some of the conversations that you have to have with kids. They're difficult conversations when you have to tell a kid, hey, right now you're not where you need to be. But giving them that roadmap, like what Keith was talking about, giving them a roadmap, having a kid be comfortable enough to ask the why, right? That's a big part of being a good coach, I think. And something that I think the best guys do is that guys walk out of meetings, they have an idea of where they stand. They understand what they need to do. But for a lot of guys, they've always been so good that they've never had to have that conversation. So that first one can be really difficult. And it can be a real shock to the system to be told, like, you have to get better in order to get to where you want to be. And we try to introduce that to our guys early about like the constant idea of development, and that, yes, we're working towards something, but there's a bigger picture here that we need to address. And it's the commitment to being a college player. Like one of the things we often say to guys is, you want to be a college player? We need to start acting like one. We need to start doing those things that college players are going to do. But that transition's hard, and it's hard being a player. It's also hard being a coach. And I think that sometimes you can lose sight of both of those things. Like being the head coach of a baseball program seems like an awesome thing, but there's a lot of difficult conversations that you have to make. There's a lot of difficult decisions that you have to make. And then being a college age kid, trying to find a way into the lineup with all the other stuff that you deal with academics and the social life and the weight room and travel. And that's also difficult. And it's easy to forget that.
Yeah, for sure. The travel part, like, I mean, especially this time of year, kids coming from the East Coast who are freshmen who are flying to Arizona and California and they're out of state for 4 or 5 days, right? And if you're not playing and you've got to be doing schoolwork, like it could be overwhelming, I would imagine, right? Like I'm not in my dorm room for 5 days doing homework and I'm away and, there's all this stuff going on. And my conversation with them is, hey, you get to put the uniform on, right? Is better than not. Put the uniform on, soak it in, try to get better, try to learn something, right? You may not like the fact that you're not playing. You may not like the fact that you could be doing something else and it's frustrating, but like put the uniform on, enjoy it, make the most out of it and try to like learn from the experience. And I think that's a hard thing. Listen, you guys were players. I was everybody who puts on the uniform wants to play too, right? Like you don't want to sit in the dugout. You don't want to watch. You want to play, right? And if I'm not playing, that's hard. But you got to learn how to deal with that, right? And that's part of what mental skills is about. Hey, I can't do anything about this right now. So what am I going to do? Am I going to sulk about it? Am I going to have bad body language? Am I going to bring the energy of the team down? Or am I going to go, hey, my name's not on the card, or I'm not hot tonight. What am I going to do? I'm going to be there. I'm going to watch. I'm going to try to learn. I'm going to observe. I'm going to pick my teammates up, do the best I can in that role so that like I start to build that trust in another way, right? Like, hey, I'm committed to this. I'm committed to this team. Now, coaches notice that stuff, right? If you're the bad body language guy with a bad attitude and you're quiet, like you may not think they know, but they know, right? And so like make the most out of whatever your role is. And I think that's easy for me to say, hard to do, but it's important because that's what's going to earn the trust to get you the shot at getting on the field versus being like, this guy's a headache. I'm not going to deal with him. I'm just going to let him sit there and rot.
It's funny how it usually works out well for the guys who are really good teammates and show up every day and do the things that they're supposed to do. It's not a coincidence that they're the ones who get that at bat in a blowout game. They're the ones who get a spot start if somebody gets injured, because to your point and to Keith's point, they've proven that they're willing to do all of the small stuff without necessarily the big glory on the back end of it. That kid who shows up every day to practice and you never have to worry about the effort that he's going to put in. He's not a problem off the field. On game day, he prepares like he's going to be a starter. When he's in the dugout, he's engaged. When you look down the bench and you're looking for an opportunity to get somebody in a bat, those guys don't get overlooked. Because as a coach, you see that and you want to give that kid that opportunity. Yeah. And for a lot of freshmen who are on campus right now, if you do that long enough, you may not see it your freshman year, but all of a sudden you've prepared every day really well. You've been locked in on game day. You're a really good teammate. You've learned how to assimilate into the system. When you get there as a sophomore, now you're ready to go. And you don't think about your freshman year where you didn't play. Now you're focused on, I'm a sophomore. I've been through this. I know how to do this. I belong here. And now you're in a position because you've built up some of that capital, right? It may not have come in the form of a bunch of game at bats, but that coach knows this is a dude I can rely on. And you're going to get a fair shake at some point. And for most freshmen, that's the reality of being a college player, is that there's not a lot of freshmen. And we talked about this briefly at the beginning, right before we got on, but we highlight the freshmen in college baseball because they're usually uber talented. But the reality is there's not a lot of freshmen in college baseball, specifically at the Division I level, that are getting a ton of routine at bats in a ton of routine innings right away. Not in today's game, because it's an old sport now with the transfer portal and the extra years. The freshmen who are willing to stick to the process, who are willing to show up every day, focus on getting better, focusing on how can I potentially be a contributor, right? Is it a pinch run? Is it a pinch hit? Those guys in the long term, it plays out well for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another conversation I've been having a lot lately, which is be ready for the opportunity, right? Like, and that is mental, right? How do I stay focused mentally so that when my name gets called and he says, hey, grab a bat, or hey, go get hot, like I'm ready for it because I haven't checked out or because I haven't started to feel sorry for myself, right? And like, just be ready for that opportunity, because you know what? if you do get the opportunity and you're not ready, you're not getting another one. And that is a challenge, right? Like it's a challenge for the kid, but like it can also be used as a motivation. Like, hey, you know what? I'm going to show up every day and do my work and get myself ready. So when that opportunity comes, I'm going to show that I'm capable of this. And like, I think that's hard for anybody to do. I think we all sort of suffer from that as human beings. Like, hey, you know what? I haven't really been getting the attention that I want. I'm just going to kind of shut down. But don't be surprised when the opportunity comes. If it does and you're not ready, you might not see it again, right? So it's really about reinforcing that, hey, be ready, be ready, be ready, be ready. And that takes practice, like you said, in the practice, in your reps and practice. Just sticking with that one at a time, one at a time. I'm going to play every rep the same way at max effort with max attitude. And I'm going to condition myself to be that kind of player, because who doesn't like that kind of player? Even if I'm not have the highest ability level, I still want that guy on my team, and I'm going to give him a shot, to your point, when there's an opportunity, because he's at least earned that opportunity. And then whatever he does with it, that's up to him.
So as a closer here, this would be slightly different than what we usually ask. We usually ask, like, what were some, for coaches, be like, what were some of the tips that you would give kids who are going through the recruiting process? But I think for you, it would be more, what are some tips that you would give the young players about things that they can implement into their routine, just to give them kind of the starter pack of ways to start to sharpen their tools from a mental performance perspective?
It's a good question. I think I would say, first of all, I would start with the question by saying, the statement of saying, you never know who's watching, right? And so what I mean by that is, you might not think you're being watched, but that controllable stuff that you do, like the body language, the facial expressions, the effort, the attitude, there might be somebody who's watching you that you don't realize, right? So if you operate under that premise that someone's always watching you, you're going to always play hard. You're always going to be engaged. You're always going to be doing those little things, even if the play on the field is not there, right? And then I would say, like, start to become aware of when you struggle, right? Like what are the situations where you start to break down, or when you maybe blow a gasket, or when you start to get down on yourself, right? Because there's probably one or two or three situations where it's like, well, I struck out with men on base, or, and like that awareness is really critical, because once you're aware of it, now you could start to pay attention to it and go, hey, what am I going to do differently? Maybe it is give myself a cue to sort of challenge that, or, hey, I'm just going to take a breath when I notice that I'm getting caught up in something that really bothers me. I'm going to try to relax it. Because I think I could give any sort of tip, right? But it's got to be unique to the player. It's like, hey, know what gets under your skin and be aware of it. Don't be afraid of it, so that then you have the ability to make the change you need to make. And I think a lot of kids they're not aware, nor do they even want to be aware, because it makes them uncomfortable. Like, just kind of lean into like the stuff that you struggle with, and then go, well, how can I change this? Can I take a deep breath? Can I give myself a cue? Can I click my spikes together? Whatever it is that I need to do to bring my brain back to what I'm doing right now. But if I don't know I'm doing it, I got no shot.
Well said. That awareness piece is huge.
Yeah.
Before we sign off on here, tell the listeners where they can find you, social media wise, how they could potentially get in touch with you if they have interest in speaking to you about what you do. Give the listeners a rundown of that, please.
Absolutely. Well, my website is Michael V as in Vincent Huber.com, and all my socials are there. I've got a bunch of free resources, podcast blogs, stuff they can use for baseball, that they could start to prep themselves on a mental skill side without actually having a coach involved. My Instagram is Michael V Huber as well. That's where I spend most of my time on social media. So if you wanted to DM me, you could do that, or you can contact me through the website.
All right. Wonderful. Well, we really appreciate your time. I think that was a great conversation. I certainly enjoyed it. I have to say that I wish that I had even the slightest bit of knowledge that I have now about how important this can be when I was a player. And, for families that are listening, I think it's worth something kicking the tires on. And if nothing else, hopefully we're able to take something out of this conversation that you can put into practice and just have a little bit of awareness on how you can hit the reset button and put your best foot forward. The mental side of this game is incredibly important. And I think that it can elevate a lot of guys if they're willing to tackle it and take it serious. So I really appreciate your time. Pleasure having you on, and maybe we'll have you again on in the future.
It was great to meet you guys. I love being here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, everybody. Tune in next week. We'll talk to you then. Thank you for listening this week. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and smash that like button for us. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EMD Baseball. If you want to find out what me and Keith do to help families and players navigate the recruiting process, go ahead and check us out on emdbaseball.com. Take a few minutes to check out our new online academy. I promise you'll get some good information out of that. Thanks again for listening. Check in with you next week.